As I said, my name's Sebastian. I'm a psychologist by background and training. I'm particularly interested in how we can make sustained change in organizations around the areas of management development and performance management, and in this instance, for customer service. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we're going to explore over the next 30 minutes or so the human side of customer service and how we can take customers from feeling perhaps a little bit deluded about the service they're receiving or about an organization to feeling much more devoted. And this is how our time is going to break down. So initially, we're going to have a look at why does service matter? Why is it something that businesses do obsess over, that is very much part of the conversation in terms of how we help businesses perform well? Is it worth focusing on? What's the evidence that it is worth focusing on? And then we're going to have a look at the current state. So we've done a very significant review, both in terms of what seems to be going wrong, but also in terms of what seems to make it go right. So initially, we're going to have a look at what's wrong with the current state, what's hard, why do businesses struggle with customer service, and then we're going to have a look at the drivers of devotion. So how can we take a customer from feeling a little bit deluded to feeling devoted? And then finally, what we're going to focus on is the impact that we can have in practice. So in terms of a real-life case study, what does this look like when it is made real, when it is made practical? So let's have an initial look at service matters. And there's no question that it makes a difference to profitability, to organizational growth by focusing on customers. And actually, very much in the early research, the customer service and profitability chain is very well established. And some organizations go as far to say, and some research goes as far to say, that really for long-term impact and for long-term profitability, it makes much more sense to focus on the customer than it does actually on the bottom line. And so by shifting our focus, we actually get to where we want to, which is a more profitable or more successful organization. Now, that's almost a given, I think, in today's market. The interesting question is, what underpins that sense of satisfaction, and what underpins that link back into business success? And when we look at what makes the difference, ultimately what it comes down to, and it's particularly from a psychological perspective, it comes down to loyalty. And you can see that a 5% increase in customer retention, so retaining customers, creating a loyalty amongst customers, increases profits by 25 to 50% by some studies. And what's driving that loyalty? It's actually the feeling of what the psychologists call reciprocity. It's the unconscious or subconscious desire to actually return a favor, and it happens amongst all of us. We're constantly party or subject to reciprocal relationships. Someone does us a favor and we feel indebted to them. And often this can actually be an unconscious impact. It can happen without us necessarily realizing it. Now, given that particular sense of reciprocity and loyalty, there are loads of ways in which customer service makes a difference. And the first is the fact that it gives us a competitive edge. And it's a competitive edge that, in fact, more and more people intend to compete with. So again, in a recent study by The Economist, 55% of business leaders expect to compete on service in 2020, compared with only 9% on price. So customer service as a competitive differentiator is becoming more and more of a focus. We also see there's a significant return in sales. Again, because of that loyalty, we can see 12 times the return on sales for those organizations that do make customer service a priority versus those that don't. So it's an additive aspect to an organization, but it's also a protective one in the fact that it really makes a difference to reputation. It can protect reputation. I particularly find this statistic a little bit on the surprisingly high side, but in one, again, recent study, 95% of customers say that they would talk about a negative experience on social media. So people get onto Facebook, they get onto Twitter, and start to talk about the experiences that they've had, both good and in particular bad. So quality customer service has a protective aspect or protective nature to it. And of course, complacency and the complacency around customers has a very, very negative impact. So other studies have shown that 86% of customers have quit doing business because of a particularly bad customer experience. Now, again, for many people on this call, this is going to be a given. Good customer service is super important. It's protective, it's additive, and it makes a significant difference. The interesting thing is that very frequently businesses actually overestimate the quality of their service. So in a study that was done by McKinsey, they found that 80% of organizations broadly rated their service as superior. But when they went and talked to those organizations' customers, only 9% of those customers agreed. So there's no question that there's a strong focus on making service work, but there is a misperception about the quality of service between what the organization thinks and what their customers think. So what's going wrong? What makes this hard? Well, the first thing is that the front line aren't necessarily present, let alone prescient. They're not necessarily aware of what's going on around them. They start to fall into autopilot, and by front line we mean people who are interfacing directly with customers. They're on autopilot. Often they're missing cues, they're following process or scripts, they've fallen into old habits that may have worked in the past. And actually their minds are often on other things. They're thinking about their children, they're thinking about bills, they're thinking about their boss. In fact, they're thinking about just about everything other than necessarily the customer that is standing in front of them. And this is interesting because can you necessarily blame them given the fact that they're often treated as though they are the bottom of the pile? The people who do interface with customers, particularly in large retail organizations, are often the ones who are given perhaps a little bit less credibility or a little bit less status than others. And this is particularly, I mean, the fact that that frontline aren't necessarily present or prescient is backed up by this piece of research where it looked at why customers actually left an organization. Was it because of competitive pressures? Was it because of a different reason, like, for example, there was no longer a need for a particular product? Was it a result of dissatisfaction? Or actually, was it the attitude of indifference on behalf of the frontline individual? So the frontline person was effectively indifferent to the customer. And when I first saw this research, I think it's very interesting, really quite surprising in terms of the impact that it had. Competitors were only 8% of the reason why customers left. The general bucket of other factors was only 9%. Dissatisfied with the product was actually only 14%. So you bought a fridge that didn't work properly, or alternatively, the business service you received wasn't quite at the level that you wanted, or your telephony didn't quite function, or only 14% of the reason why customers left. The attitude of indifference on behalf of those representing the organization accounted for 66% of the sample. So an absolutely huge proportion of the reasons why customers are departing is this attitude of indifference of the front line, of the people who are interfacing directly with customers. So what's the second reason? And this is linked. It's the fact that the problem is everybody else. So if I'm a frontline person, I say, well, yeah, you can blame me and you can say it's my fault, but actually the issue is everybody else, not necessarily me at all. And this was a study that we did with an organization that we're working with, where we asked the front line to rate their ability in building trust, in making things easy for clients and for customers, and caring for them. And the front line, the average score was round about 8 or 9 out of 10 on a 10-point scale. We then asked them to rate the rest of the company or their colleagues, and what they came up with was with scores that were almost half of what they rated themselves. Now again, this is really interesting because the first thing it illustrates is the self-awareness potentially of the front line. They're overestimating the quality of service that they believe they are giving to their customers. The second thing is that these results actually mean that you can end up with a culture of apathy and a culture of learned helplessness around the organization. I'm less willing to make an effort, and I'm less willing to try and solve the customer's problem because I know the rest of the company won't engage in the same way that I am. And so given that, I won't lean in, I won't solve problems, and actually what you end up with is a culture of almost bad karma around the customer. It's not an issue if you don't quite solve the problem and you throw it back into the mix because no one else is really pulling their weight either. And so there's this very interesting cultural shift around that needs to be made around the perceptions of how people are performing in the culture and how they focus and deal with customers. There are then a series of other issues. Often there's way more stick and not enough carrot in the way in which people talk about customers. There are league tables, there are missed targets, there is process compliance, instead of actually being positively attended to and thinking about the individual interests of the individual. Part of that is because frontline managers actually are led to care a lot less about the people and care a lot more about the targets. So there's data purity, there's process focus, there is workflow management, there are compliance requests and delivering on those things. There are all the things they need to focus on that actually stop them from getting out there and coaching and focusing and attending to their customers. And again, another client that we worked with, we went and spoke to the frontline managers about how they were feeling about dealing with customers and actually about coaching their team members. And one of the quotes that came back was, whenever I stand up from my desk, I feel like I have to run the gauntlet. You know, as people stand up and start bombarding me with questions and start asking me things, I try and run the gauntlet as quickly as possible and make it to my desk as quickly as possible so I can actually complete the things that head office has asked me to complete. So the frontline managers are very much led to care, and it's a pity because this woman wanted very much to engage and deal with the people, but she just didn't feel she had the capacity to do so, nor did she feel she had the capability to do so. The next is around leaders, and this is very much about setting a mood around customer service. And very frequently what you see is the fact that leaders don't talk directly to customers, and if they do talk about customers, it's actually at a level of abstraction that no longer really makes sense to people who are serving customers on a daily basis. Sure, they talk about customer segmentation, talk about the value proposition effectively that needs to be used for customers. There's all sorts of things that relate to customers, but they don't necessarily get into the more emotional, the more personal, the more actually intimate conversations that need to take place that really give a strong sense of a culture and an organization that is attending to and focusing on customers. And then this is compounded by the haze of initiatives that can start to take place with an organization. So customer service, of course, it comes first, but so does sales, safety, supplier management, and those are the things that just begin with S. And so what you end up with is almost leadership ADHD, where leaders are thinking about all the different things that they can focus on. They're talking about why customers are important, but really that message gets lost in translation and actually gets lost in the transition to the people who make the difference for the customers. Okay, so those are the issues, and some of you on the call may very well be familiar or feel that you have some of those in your organization. What can you do to make the shift? What are the steps and the drivers that you can take to take customers from deluded to devoted? And at MindGym, we engaged in a very large-scale literature review. We looked at hundreds of academic studies, 50 very specifically into the realm of customer service. We interviewed leaders of customer service functions as well as leaders of learning and development and OD functions that supported customer service. And these were the themes that really came through strongly. The first is, well, the first two are really about building the will and the energy and momentum to make a shift. And the first aspect of this is leaders in particular building belief that this is something that needs to, that customers and creating devoted customers and that sense of loyalty is something that it genuinely is the #1 priority. It is the first amongst, if there are equals, it's the first amongst equals, or it is actually the leading light. It is the frame for the way in which the organization needs to see themselves and market themselves to the outside world. And so a really, really strong sense of belief, and why from an organizational narrative perspective, why the story needs to be built around customers. From there, we look at customer chat. So that is very much the stories and the stories that are actually told about customers and the conversations that are happening informally about customers and how they operate and what it means to deliver high quality service. And those are practical, real stories that people can feel they can connect with at both a rational and a logical level, but at an emotional one too. And that is ultimately, if you want to change a culture, you change the stories that they tell, and that's the thing that begins to build the momentum, and is very much led by the leaders. The second aspect, so if the first aspect is the will element, the second aspect is much more about skill, and it's much more about capability. And this is about serving and engaging the customers effectively. It's about building frontline know-how. And then finally, creating a culture where people coach so that individuals can flourish. So they feel like they're growing, they feel like they're learning, and in so doing, they then start to serve customers better. Now, when we take that second part together, the serve and engage, the frontline know-how, and the coaching to flourish, really what we start to talk about is a service climate, an internal service climate, and a service culture. And there's been some fascinating research that I'd like to share with you that specifically focuses on how we can serve colleagues as well as customers to really improve the quality of the service climate. So what we can see there, what this graph starts to illustrate is customer satisfaction. And what we can see is that those organizations that score in the top 25% for service climate, so the way in which people support each other, the way in which people are responsive to one another within the organization, so that's the service climate, the way they serve each other internally, is shown to be, those organizations that are in the top 25% have got significantly superior customer satisfaction to those that don't. And this is the thing that starts to get over some of those issues around, well, the problem is everybody else. Now, interestingly, again, we talked about the chain between customer satisfaction and profitability. What we can also see here is how, where we look at stock market value, those firms that score in the top 25% on service climate are also those that have got higher stock market value measured by Tobin's Q. So you can start to see it's definitely correlated, and I would argue there is a strong link here between, or causal link here, between the internal service culture leading to customer satisfaction, which then really builds a strong sense of loyalty, which then, of course, improves the stock market value for the organization. So how do we go about delivering this? What are the aspects of building this strong internal service climate? And really, when we look at the skills, the capability that needs to be built, again, from the large-scale literature review and from the interviews we did, the first two things which we've touched on already is really about how we can start to help individuals pay attention. How can they be mentally present? How can they listen actively? How can they be looking out for the cues and the clues that customers provide about the way in which they want to be treated? Does this person want to be treated directly and quickly, or is this person more interested in a bit of a conversation? What is it that they're describing in terms of their needs? Very much attending to and paying attention to those aspects is absolutely crucial. Getting people out of autopilot, getting people out of their traditional habits. The second aspect is about building trust, and this is both trust for one another and, of course, within the organization, and trust with the customer. And that is about rapport and building a strong sense and demonstrating a strong sense of interest for the customer, demonstrating empathy and being authentic. In one fascinating study, a psychologist called Robert Cialdini looked at the way in which servers and waiters in restaurants could start to increase their tips. And actually the thing that he discovered was one of the best ways, a very, very significant increase in tips was using the exact words that the person ordering had used. So rather than saying, you know, if you ordered a cappuccino with only a little bit of milk, you'd say, okay, that's a cappuccino, not too much milk. That's not quite making that connection the right way. And actually the tip increase, if you use just a little bit of milk, the same language as the customer, they saw a very significant increase. So this trust and this empathy and this authentic understanding is absolutely crucial. The next element is about ownership. And I think that again, when you're talking about large-scale populations with sometimes not quite as much visibility as people would like as to taking responsibility for certain accounts or certain customer relationships, ownership can be a really challenging thing to start to implement and try and create as a cultural aspect. And this is about being accountable, helping to manage the customer's expectations and actually seeing something through to the end. So rather than passing it on or flinging it over the fence, it's really taking responsibility to do that. What we've seen in the marketplace is a very significant trend towards organizations looking to devolve decision-making responsibility to frontline staff. And actually, there was, again, a big study done that discovered that 76% of organizations that were leading in customer service have actually devolved a good deal of the decision-making to the frontline staff. And this is partly because even if customers have actually report failed service or they report that something hasn't quite worked, if they experience a positive service experience to try and solve that problem, they actually then feel much better about the organization more broadly. And so, often, there's a sense that we want control, we want consistency, and therefore what we'll do is we'll script everything, we'll have very tight processes. In fact, there is very much more of a trend to having people towards organizations devolving some of that decision-making, of course within parameters, so that people can take responsibility. And actually there are significant benefits to that for the individuals themselves. Again, if we look at the psychology, if people feel like they've got that responsibility to take ownership, they feel much more competent and they become much more engaged in what they do. And there are plenty, when you hear about the story, so for example, there's an organization called Rackspace, who are a cloud computing business. And one of the stories that they have is that they were in the middle of quite a long service call, and they heard the person at the other end saying to another individual that they were very hungry. And the person who was taking the call, the customer advisor who was taking the call, when they put the customer on hold for a moment, they also ordered a pizza at the customer's address. And 30 minutes later, because it was a long call to try and do some troubleshooting, 30 minutes later, there was a ring on the doorbell, the customer stood up, and there was a pizza there for that individual, and of course they felt hugely attended to. Now, stories of significant customer attention like that often come to that sense of the individuals taking ownership, but also being empowered to take the ownership to solve those sorts of problems. The next skill almost that we need to engender and to encourage people in is how they can start to add value. And that's making recommendations, particularly in a compelling way that's relevant to the individual, not pushy, but instead that's tailored around the customer's need, and actually thinking about how they innovate around that. And there are different aspects of that. Again, the psychology has shown us that there are different aspects in the way in which we can do that, which I want to share with you now. The first one is about really building an understanding. The second one is demonstrating a strong sense of expertise, and there are plenty of studies that demonstrate where people are actually greater experts in terms of the products, they also tend to have, so increase in product knowledge also increases sales and satisfaction. And finally, social proof, so they believe that other people are doing the same thing as them, making the connection in the way in which people make recommendations to other people similar to the customer increase that sense of satisfaction. And actually it was a study that was done by PwC. They found that when you look at what actually constitutes a positive experience of support, 31% of the variance, so 31% of what leads to that feeling of a positive service experience comes from staff recommendations. So being able to do that makes a massive difference. And then, of course, what we have is the coaching to flourish. And many of you on the call, I'm sure, will be strong believers and advocates of high-quality coaching, and it makes a huge difference. And trying to recast those frontline managers' roles as being about coaching, as well as, of course, managing workflow and the operational aspects of first-line management. But actually trying to engender that sense of coaching makes a huge difference. And there's tons of evidence to demonstrate how this coaching makes a difference. And performance management, which is focusing on high-quality feedback, its consistent differentiation, and coaching, leads to increases in employee engagement, in customer loyalty, reduces turnover, and boosts productivity. And so those 5 aspects of within almost the whole organization, particularly amongst those people who are dealing with customers and those who are supporting the people who are on the front line, really does lead to significant improvements in customer service. This is all great and I've given some practical examples, but this is all great in theory. What does it work in practice? So let's turn to a very practical example. And this was a program that MindGym did we had the great privilege of doing with Santander. And what Santander were experiencing were a decline in customer service. And so what the shift they wanted to make was to turn Santander into the bank that people wanted to bank with. And actually the turnaround has been significant, but just to hark back a moment, they had declining service. Santander at the time were bottom of the client, the customer service league table for banking. And they were also rated as the 3rd worst bank for customer service within the UK. So it was clear that a turnaround was required. And I'm delighted to say everybody got behind this. Let me show you what the program looked like. Initially, there was a launch at Wembley Stadium, and this was where the executive, the divisional directors, the regional managers, the branch managers came together, and they shared their story of belief, and they shared their stories around the customers. So that front-end bit around how you can create the momentum and how you can create the stories was very much prevalent there. And there were some key messages. The first one was about putting customers first. The second one was the fact that everybody was part of the problem, but also everybody was part of the solution. And so there was a very strong focus on creating that shared sense of ownership. And thirdly, it was the personal aspect of it, and that was the fact that by working well with customers, actually the individuals made their lives easier. So there was a personal win that was very much part of the story. And that was important for individuals who might have been interested in improving the quality of the bank, but really their primary interest was actually improving the quality of their own lives. And so that managing those two messages was key. And actually this launch was fantastic. The leaders were candid, they were authentic, they told great stories, and it really built the momentum. But that alone is not enough. You know, grand gestures does not change cultures. And so what then happened was there were a series of bite-sized experiences over time that continued to focus and continued to underscore the importance of these changes. In many respects, help reinforce that belief, but also build the capability. And to make this scalable, what happened was that this was introduced by the regional managers. It was delivered by MindGym to branch managers, and part of that half day was the branch managers then learning to deliver that particular session and that focus to their people within the branches, within the retail bank. So what did the different sessions look like? Well, the first one was about seeing it and solving it, and that was a really strong focus on creating language where people spotted good, bad, and ugly behavior. It was about raising people's awareness about what constituted good quality service. The second one, where we got into trust, was very much that point around trust and empathy. So how can you make decisions that also bear in mind the commercial aspects of the bank's interests, but deliver to the customer as well? And so we shared some dilemmas and asked people to think about how they might solve those dilemmas with some guidance. From there, it was into how, the third session was about how you can ultimately add value, and it was called How Can I Help You? And the focus on this one was understanding what the customers value and how you can respond to those needs, and also how you can deal with complaints in the right way. So how you can take preventative action to deal with complaints so that the problems are solved. And finally, the last one, called Power in Your Hands, the last one I'm going to share with you now, was all about coaching and really giving the branch managers the ability and the energy and the permission to engage in high quality coaching with their teams. So this was run in distributed fashion over around about 6 months, and there were activities that the branch managers needed to do over time. So what were the results? The self-report results were very, very strong. Particularly, we had things like identified things my branch team can do differently to improve the customer's experience. 98% of people reported that. I feel able to apply the tools from Customer First now and into the new bank was 98%. So the anecdotal evidence was extremely strong. What was the evidence like in practice? Well, first of all, in terms of the results, Santander went on to win the Best National Branch Network Award for Your Money Direct Awards for 2012 and for 2013, so 2 years in a row. And they also won the Most Improved Bank for Customer Service in the UK from the MoneyWise Customer Service Awards. So there was a very, very significant recognition of the shift that Santander had successfully made. And what's interesting about this also, and I think this is a lovely quote from Steve Bateman, who's the head of UK banking from Santander, is that he says that improving the service we offer at Santander UK is our top priority. We do have more to do and continue to focus relentlessly on improving the levels of service we provide to our customers. And the reason I like this quote in particular is because it has that sense of humility about the fact there is always more work to be done. And the fact that the focus and the conversation on making it better, on continuing to focus on the customers is absolutely there, as well as underscoring the fact it is the top priority. Now, in terms of hard business metrics, there were also some really good improvements. The first thing was that banking complaints reduced by 23% from the first half of 2012. So there was a very significant reduction in banking complaints, which is amazing. And also in terms of there was an independent measure that looked at satisfaction. It's known as FRS, and that score rose to 57%, which saw Santander significantly close the gap to the top 3 performers within the retail banking space over the last year. So in terms of the improvement story, when you get the leaders who really start to build strong sense of belief and who really start to focus and tell the stories, real stories about customers, when you really get to focus on building that skill in terms of serving and engaging people internally, in terms of the frontline know-how and driving high-quality coaching into the organization, and you do it in a distributed manner, you can really start to see those shifts happen and success follow. That is our half hour. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining the webinar. If you do have any questions, do please put them into the Q&A box. Also, if you'd like, you can follow or write to me or the Mind Gym and using our Twitter handles or our email addresses. The Twitter handle for the Mind Gym is @TheMindGym, and the Twitter handle for me is @Dr. Seb Bailey. We also have a white paper, which is on our website, that actually covers all of this in much more detail. It goes into really strong evidence base with the references and some of the more nuanced points that you can download from our website. And I just want to say thank you very much for joining, and I hope you have a fantastic afternoon or morning or evening wherever you are in the world.